New Historicism an Example, page 173, para. As an example of new historicism in practice, let us take a closer look at an essay not by Greenblatt, but by Louis Montrose, Montrose. His essay, A Midsummer Night's Dream and the Shaping Fantasies of Elizabethan Culture, Gender, Power, Form, appeared originally in the American journal Representations, the house magazine of the New Historicism, and is reprinted in Wilson and Dutton, DUTTON. Montrose's famous definition of New Historicism is that it centers upon the historicity of the text and the textuality of history, and the essay might be seen as an embodiment of that pronouncement. His overall thesis is that the play, quote, creates the culture by which it is created, shapes the fantasies by which it is shaped, unquote, page 130. Thus, the cult of the Virgin Queen is both fostered by literature like Spenser's SPENSER', the Fairy Queen, FAERIE, Fairy, Queen, QUEENE, and a whole range of court masks and pageants, and at the same time generate such literature. Life and literature stimulate and play upon each other. Elizabeth can project herself as the queen whose virginity has mystical and magical potency because such images are given currency in court masks, MASQUES, in comedies, and in pastoral epic poetry. Conversely, the figure of Elizabeth stimulates the production and promotion of such work and imagery. Hence, in this sense, history is textualized and texts are historicized. A simple modern parallel would be the way images of masculinity and femininity in film pervade our lives and offer us ways of representing ourselves. They give us role models which we can become trapped inside, so that real life mimics the filmic representation of life. Page 174. Para. Montrose's essay also represents the eclecticism of New Historicism, for it draws upon psychoanalysis, especially Freudian dream analysis and feminism. It opens with an account of Simone Forman's FORMAN''s dream already mentioned, in which Forman describes an erotic encounter with the queen, then an elderly woman. The dream turns on the pun, PUN, of wait upon the queen and WAIT, wait upon the queen, and wait, WEIGHT, upon her. Her dress is trailing in the mud, and he offers to solve the problem by causing her belly to lift. Quote, I mean to wait upon you, not under you, unquote. In the dream, Forman has just saved the queen from being pestered by, quote, a weaver, a tall man with a reddish beard, unquote, and Montrose interprets this as an Oedipal triangle. He links this to the queen's projection of herself as mother of the nation, but also as a virgin who is openly flirtatious and provocative. Montrose quotes the French ambassador's accounts of her extremely revealing style of dress. Quote, she kept the front of her dress open and one could see the whole of her bosom, unquote, page 111. He then relates all this to the tensions generated by the peculiar situation that a highly patriarchal society in which all power was vested in men was nevertheless ruled by a woman who therefore had absolute powers of life over all her subjects, men and women, and the power to advance or end the careers of her male courtiers. In Shakespeare's play, there are several instances of a queen who is, quote, mastered, unquote, and thereby feminized, dash. Hippolyta, Hippolyta, the Amazonian queen, has been defeated by Theseus, whom she must now submit to and marry. Titania, queen of the fairies, has defied her husband Oberon in her attachment to the changeling boy, and hence is humiliated by him in having Puck, P-U-C-K, administer the magic potion which makes her fall in love with the first being she sees on waking. Throughout the play there is much about the rights of fathers over daughters and husbands over wives, and the precondition of male desire is female subjection. The happy ending depends upon the reinforcement of patriarchy. Indent opens. The festive conclusion of A Midsummer Night's Dream, its celebration of romantic and generative heterosexual union, depends upon the success of a process whereby the female pride and power manifested in misanthropic warriors, possessive mothers, unruly wives, and willful daughters are brought under the control of husbands and lords. Page 120. Indent closes. Page 175. Hence it is suggested the play might be seen as implicitly treasonous, since, indent opens, when a virgin ruler is ostensibly the virgin mother of her subjects, then the themes of male procreative power, autogeny, and mastery of women acquire a seditious resonance. Stop. In royal pageantry, the queen is always the cynosure, semicolon. Her virginity is the source of magical potency. Stop. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, however, such magical powers are invested in the king. Indent closes. Page 127, para. Hence, quote, Shakespeare's comedy symbolically neutralizes the royal power to which it ostensibly pays homage, unquote, page 127. In practice, patriarchy is maintained in spite of the presence of a woman at the pinnacle of power, by constantly insisting on Elizabeth's difference from other women. This is a familiar strategy even today, for having a female leader did not lead the Tory party to revise its ideas about the role of women in society. On the contrary, under the rule of the Iron Lady, an interesting locution, L-O-C-U-T-I-O-N, in this context, reactionary ideas were reinforced and strengthened. Thus, Elizabeth's rule was not intended to undermine the male hegemony of her culture. Indeed, the emphasis upon her difference from other women may have helped to reinforce it. Page 124. If the pageants and the encomiums constantly proclaimed her simultaneously, quote, maiden, matron, and mother, unquote, then she becomes not a real woman but a religious mystery. Throughout the essay, then, the account of the play entwines it with male attempts to come to terms with the simultaneous existence of a female monarch and a rigorous patriarchal structure. For male courtiers, there might seem to be a certain unmanning within quote, UNMANNING, involved in being chaste servants of the Virgin Queen, while those who sought advancement from her seemed like children seeking the favors of the nation's mother. Parenthesis. Montrose describes an extravagant and protracted entertainment in which Raleigh and R-A-L-E-I-G-H and Greville Greville acted out this metaphor. Parenthesis closes. All this demonstrates what is meant in practice by insisting upon the historicity of the text and the textuality of history. Section Cultural Materialism, para. The British critic Graham Holderness describes cultural materialism as, quote, a politicized form of historiography, unquote, stop. We can explain this as meaning the study of historical material, page 176. which includes literary texts within a politicized framework, this framework including the present, which those literary texts have in some way helped to shape. The term cultural materialism was made current in 1985 when it was used by Jonathan Dollimore, Dollimore, and Alan Sinfield, Sinfield, the best known of the cultural materialists, as the subtitle of their edited collection of essays, Political Shakespeare. They define the term in a foreword as designating a critical method which has 4 characteristics. It combines an attention to 1. Historical context, 2. Theoretical method, 3. Political commitment, and 4. Textual analysis. Para. To comment briefly on each of these, firstly, the emphasis on historical context undermines the transcendent significance traditionally accorded to the literary text. Here the word transcendent roughly means timeless. The position taken, of course, needs to face the obvious objection that if we are today still studying and reading Shakespeare, then his plays have indeed proved themselves timeless in the simple sense that they are clearly not limited by the historical circumstances in which they were produced. But this is a matter of degree. The aim of this aspect of cultural materialism is to allow the literary text to recover its histories, which previous kinds of study have often ignored. The kind of history recovered would involve relating the plays to such phenomena as, quote, enclosures and the oppression of the rural poor, state power and resistance to it, witchcraft, the challenge and containment of the carnivalesque, carnivalesque, unquote. Dollimore and Sinfield, page 3. Secondly, the emphasis on theoretical method signifies a break with liberal humanism and absorbing the lessons of structuralism, post-structuralism, and other approaches which have become prominent since the 1970s. Thirdly, the emphasis on political commitment signifies the influence of Marxist and feminist perspectives and break from the conservative Christian framework which hitherto dominated Shakespeare criticism. Finally, the stress on textual analysis, quote, locates the critique of traditional approaches where it cannot be ignored, unquote. In other words, there is a commitment not just to making theory of an abstract kind, but to practicing it on mainly canonical texts, page 177, which continue to be the focus of massive amounts of academic and professional attention and which are prominent national and cultural icons. Para. The 2 words in the term, quote, cultural materialism, unquote, are further defined. Culture will include all forms of culture, quote, forms like television and popular music and fiction, unquote. That is, this approach does not limit itself to high cultural forms like the Shakespeare play. Materialism signifies the opposite of idealism. An idealist belief would be that high culture represents the free and independent play of the talented individual mind. The contrary materialist belief is that culture cannot, quote, transcend the material forces and relations of production. Culture is not simply a reflection of the economic and political system, but nor can it be independent of it, unquote. These comments on materialism represent the standard beliefs of Marxist criticism, and they do perhaps point to the difficulty of making a useful distinction between a straight Marxist criticism and cultural materialism. However, it is added that the relevant history is not just that of 400 years ago, but that of the times, including our own, in which Shakespeare is produced and reproduced. Thus, in cultural materialism, there is an emphasis on the functioning of the institutions through which Shakespeare is now brought to us: the Royal Shakespeare Company, the film industry, the publishers who produce textbooks for school and college, and the national curriculum, which lays down the requirement that specific Shakespeare plays be studied by all school pupils. Para. Cultural materialism takes a good deal of its outlook and its name from the British left-wing critic Raymond Williams. Instead of Foucault's notion of discourse, Williams invented the term structures of feeling. These are concerned with, quote, meanings and values as they are lived and felt, unquote. Structures of feeling are often antagonistic both to explicit systems of values and beliefs and to the dominant ideologies within a society. They are characteristically found in literature and they oppose the status quo, as the values in Dickens, the Brontes, etc. represent human structures of feeling which are at variance with Victorian, commercial and materialist values. The result is that cultural materialism is much more optimistic about the possibility of change and is willing at times to see literature as a source of oppositional values. Cultural materialism particularly, page 178, involves using the past to read the present, revealing the politics of our own society by what we choose to emphasize or suppress of the past. A great deal of the British work has been about undermining what it sees as the fetishistic, fetishistic role of Shakespeare as a conservative icon with British culture. This form of cultural materialism can be conveniently sampled in 3 New Accents books: The Shakespeare Myth, Graham Holderness, Cologne, Alternative Shakespeares, edited by John Drakakis, Drakakis, and That Shakespearean Rag, Terence Hawkes. This quaint title is derived from an allusion by T.S. Eliot in The Waste Land. A correspondence in response to a review of the first of these ran for over a year in the London Review of Books under the heading Bardolatry, Bardolatry, section, How is Cultural Materialism Different from New Historicism? Para. Cultural materialism is often linked in discussion with New Historicism, its American counterpart. Though the two movements belong to the same family, there is an ongoing family quarrel between them. Political Shakespeare includes, New Historicist says, and the introduction explains some of the differences between the two movements. Para. Firstly, in a neat distinction, Dollymore and Sinfield quote Marx to the effect that men and women make their own history, but not in conditions of their own choosing, page 3. Cultural materialists, they say, tend to concentrate on the interventions whereby men and women make their own history, whereas new historicists tend to focus on the less than ideal circumstances in which they do so, that is, on the power of social and ideological structures which restrain them. The result is a contrast between political optimism and political pessimism. Para. Secondly, cultural materialists see new historicists as cutting themselves off from effective political positions by their acceptance of a particular version of post-structuralism with its radical skepticism about the possibility of attaining secure knowledge. The rise of post-structuralism problematizes knowledge, language, truth, etc., and this perspective is absorbed into new historicism and becomes an important part of it. The new historicist defense against this charge would be that being aware of the inbuilt uncertainty of all knowledge doesn't mean that we give up trying to establish truths. Page 179. It simply means that we do so conscious of the dangers and limitations involved, thus giving their own intellectual inquiries a special authority. This is rather like sailing into dangerous waters knowingly with all sensible precautions taken. rather than blithely unaware of the dangers and with all lights blessing. Thus, when new historicists claim in Peter Widdowson, Widdowson', words that Foucault gives them entry into a, quote, a non-truth-oriented form of historicist study of texts, unquote, page 161. This doesn't mean that they do not believe that what they say is true, but rather that they know the risks and dangers involved in claiming to establish truths. Para. A third important difference between new historicism and cultural materialism is that where the former's core text are documents contemporary with Shakespeare, the latter's may be program notes for a current Royal Shakespeare Company production, quotations of Shakespeare by a Gulf War pilot, or pronouncements on education by a government minister. To put this another way, the new historicist situates the literary text in the political situation of its own day, while the cultural material situates it within that of ours. This is really to restate the difference in political emphasis between the two approaches. Indeed, it could be said that all three of the differences just described have this political difference as their common denominator. Section opens Stop and Think, para. The fact that we have spent time spelling out the differences between cultural materialism and new historicism indicates that there is a considerable overlap between them. Are they just two national varieties of essentially the same thing? Or are the radical differences emphasized especially by the British cultural materialists as deep as is claimed? Para. Perhaps the question can only be properly answered by reading and comparing essays of each type. Allegedly, the differences lie mainly in two aspects. Firstly, in political outlook, and secondly, in the degree of emphasis on the post-structuralist perspectives. Page 180. Para. In thinking about the question, start by comparing the attitudes evident in the examples of each included in this book, insofar as you are able to judge from the brief accounts given. Then read and compare two further pieces, drawing on the reading suggested at the end of this section. Para. Of course, the differences between these two approaches are partly the result of their different intellectual frameworks. New historicism was much influenced by Foucault, who sees, quote, discursive practices, unquote, as frequently a reinforcement of dominant ideology. Cultural materialism, on the other hand, owes much to Raymond Williams, who sees structures of feeling as containing the seeds from which grows resistance to the dominant ideology. A skeptic about both approaches suggested that it must be hard for the new historicists to explain how the English Civil War ever got started, since they seem to envisage a pervasive state power which would make resistance virtually impossible, while for the cultural materialist it must be difficult to explain how it ever ended, since their structures of feeling constantly throw up new ideas which would seem to make stasis impossible. In practice, however, the frequently evoked political difference between the two approaches is surely less uniform and predictable than such stark dichotomies would imply. Section. What cultural materialist critics do. 1. They read the literary text, very often a Renaissance play, in such a way as to enable us to recover its histories, that is, the context of exploitation from which it emerged. 2. At the same time, they foreground those elements in the work's present transmission and contextualizing which caused those histories to be lost in the first place. For example, the heritage industry's packaging of Shakespeare in terms of history as pageant, national bard, cultural icon, and so on. 3. They use a combination of Marxist and feminist approaches to the text, especially in order to do the first of these above, and in order to fracture the previous dominance of conservative social, political, and religious assumptions in Shakespeare criticism in particular. Page 181. 4. They use the technique of close textual analysis but often employ structuralist and post-structuralist techniques, especially to mark a break with the inherited tradition of close textual analysis within the framework of conservative cultural and social assumptions. 5. At the same time, they work mainly within traditional notions of the canon on the grounds that writing about more obscure texts hardly ever constitutes an effective political intervention. For instance, in debates about the school curriculum as national or national identity. Section Cultural Materialism and Example. An example of an informal variant of this approach is Terence Hawke's essay Telma, T-E-L-M-A-H. In his book That Shakespearean Rag, this is the fourth piece in the book, each one being centered on the work of one of the major Shakespearean critics of the early part of the century, within an overall strategy of looking at how Shakespeare is mediated and processed to us. In this chapter, the critic is John Dover Wilson, best known for his 1930s book, What Happens in Hamlet. The opening section considers aspects of Hamlet, emphasizing cyclical and symmetrical elements of the play, such as how the beginning echoes the end, how the same situation occurs several times in it, like the several father-son parallels, and considering how indefinite the start and end of any performance are, since the play is already culturally situated in some way in people's minds before they see it. A repeated motif of looking backwards in the play to a past which was better than the present leads Hawkes to imagine a reversed Hamlet which shadows the actual play, the Telma of his title. Para. The second section is entitled, quote, To the Sunderland Station, unquote, alluding to the title of a well-known history of the Russian Revolution called To the Finland Station. An account is given of John Dover Wilson on the train to Sunderland in 1917, sent by the government to sort out labor problems in a munitions factory, and reading W. W. Gregg's article on Hamlet, which argues that the king's failure, page 182, to react openly to the dump show indicates that he is a figure of some complexity, not just a storybook villain. If he is this, then he begins to claim some of our attention and distract us from the exclusive focus on Hamlet himself, which had been the traditional way of responding to the play, at least from the time of the Romantics. Wilson's excited outrage at this notion is related to a fanatical desire for order manifested in his published writings about Russia, which see it as a picturesque, organic feudal state, which in turn looks like a version of the England which his social class regards with nostalgia and fears might be lost. Dover Wilson's rushing to the defense of Hamlet, the threatened cultural icon, in his reply to Gregg, and later in his Hamlet book, are seen as symptomatic of this too. Shortly after the First World War, Wilson was a member of the New Bolt Committee, which reported on the teaching of English and saw it as providing a form of social cohesion which might save the country from the fate which overtook Russia. Hawkes also quotes a letter from Neville Chamberlain praising What Happens in Hamlet, and thus creates a pattern of appeasing and containing difference. Hence, a way of interpreting the play is placed among several core texts from 20th century life, and thus the play itself is culturally transformed. Hawkes' final reading of the end of the play involves inserting an extra stage direction and his model for a criticism of this kind is that of the jazz musician who doesn't transmit a received text but transforms what he performs. That might be taken as the characteristic feature of this variant of cultural materialistic criticism. Para. It is difficult to know how to place writing of this kind. It is lively and interesting, personal and engaged in tone, and most of the formalities of academic writing are dispensed with. Openings are dramatic, transitions abrupt. Suspense is maintained by holding back key details about identity or situation till the moment of maximum impact. The structure is a series of seemingly unrelated incidents or situations which turn out to be intimately intertwined. All these features are novelistic, and there is clearly a sense in which this is creative writing which would not accept any absolute distinction between literature and criticism. As in New Historicism, literature and history are intertwined, but the perspective and the historicizing are much more those of our own day than would be the case with New Historicism itself. Page 183, section Selected Reading. Chase, C-H-A-S-E, Cynthia E.D., Romanticism, Longman Critical Reader, 1993. Contains 3 examples of new historicist approaches to the period, namely the chapters by Karen Swann, S-W-A-N-N, on Coleridge's Christabel, by Marjorie Levinson on Keats, and by Jerome Christiansen on Byron's Sardanapalus, Sardanapalus. Dollymore Jonathan and Sinfield Allen edited Political Shakespeare, New Essays in Cultural Materialism, Manchester University Press, 2nd edition, 1994. The introduction gives a useful account of new historicism and explains how it differs from cultural materialism. The book reprints Greenblatt's essay Invisible Bullets. Drekaki's John E.D., Alternative Shakespeare's, Revised Edition, Routledge 2002. The term cultural materialism is not used of these days, but they are generally representative of this approach. They seek to accelerate the break with established canons of Shakespeare's criticism, exemplifying explorations of the ways in which historically specific readings are generated. Gallagher, Catherine, and Greenblatt, Stephen, Practicing the New Historicism, University of Chicago Press, 2000. Quote, in lucid and jargon-free prose, Catherine Gallagher and Stephen Greenblatt focus on 5 central aspects of new historicism, recurrent use of anecdotes, preoccupation with the nature of representations, fascination with the history of the body, sharp focus on neglected details, and skeptical analysis of ideology, unquote. Publisher's blurb. Grady, Grady, Hugh, The Modernist Shakespeare, Oxford University Press, new edition, 1994. Pages 225-235 are on the new historicism. An excellent book, always sharp and readable. Chapter 4 on Till-Eared, the Old Historicism, is very useful chapter. Chapter 5 discusses the application of contemporary critical trends to Shakespeare. Greenblatt, Stephen, Shakespearean Negotiations, the Circulation of Social Energy in Renaissance England, California University Press, 1991. The essay Fiction and Friction on Cross-Dressing in Shakespearean Comedies is a good starting point on new historicism. The Easy Invisible Bullets is the best-known piece in the book. Hawke's Terence, That Shakespearean Rag, Methuen, 1986. Examples of cultural materialism in practice. The whole book is a lively read which makes some starting juxtapositions of Shakespeare and the circumstances in which we encounter them. Holderness Graham, The Shakespeare Myth, Manchester University Press, 1988, page 184. Studies of the culturally produced and historically determined Shakespeare myth, along with interviews with prominent mediators of Shakespeare in education, theatre, the press, and television, unquote. Levinson, Marjorie E.D., Rethinking Historicism, Critical Readings in Romantic History, Blackwell, 1989. New Historicism Applied to Romanticism. Sinfield Allen, Shakespeare, Authority, Sexuality, Unfinished Business in Cultural Materialism. Routledge, Accents on Shakespeare Series, 2006. See especially chapters 1 and 2, Unfinished Business, Problems in Cultural Materialism, and Unfinished Business 2, in this exciting book by one of the pioneers of cultural materialism, Veeser, Veeserh, Aram, Aramed, The New Historicism, Routledge, 1989, a useful and valuable source. Veeser H. Aram, The New Historicism Reader, Routledge, 1994, covers a range of British and American literature, not just a Renaissance. Wilson Richard and Dutton Richard, eds, New Historicism and Renaissance Drama, Longman, 1992. A useful collection of key articles, well introduced. Stop. Page 185, Chapter 10, Postcolonial Criticism.